the 10 commandments of disciplined software testing practices. What I'm going to talk about are things that I have seen to be very important, very critical for everyone who does testing and has and is doing anything that has to do with testing. Now, there is no really clear separation here in the topics, whether they are relevant only to test managers or test leads or test analysts or test engineers. The topics are relevant to everyone who performs any activity at all that's related to testing. In fact, many of those topics are also very relevant to developers, only if we can get developers to join us in these webinars. And I'm going to tell you this. Let me put this question in front of you here. Some of the challenging questions we have. Okay. How do you ever know? How can you tell if a requirement has been fully tested? What can you do to make sure a requirement has been fully tested? I wish we had the time to open the floor for input from the audience, but typically the answers I get are things like we test as much as we can. We take the requirement and we design tests and we run those tests. And sometimes people are a little bit more sophisticated and say we use traceability metrics or requirement traceability metrics. And what that is, in case you don't know, it's a matrix that shows for each requirement what test cases we have and how many of them have been executed and how many of them have passed and how many failed. And I'll show you an example of that traceability matrix later on in the webinar. However, that traceability matrix also does not tell me if a requirement has been reasonably or fully tested or not. It only tells me that the test cases I wrote for that requirement or for that user story, if my project is an Agile project, it only tells me those test cases, those are the ones I wrote, and those are the ones that I executed and passed or failed. But the question remains, how do I know that? How do I know that I have written enough tests for a given requirement or a given user story? We refer to this as the requirement coverage, which is different from code coverage. I'll speak about both in a little bit. But to me, requirement coverage as well as code coverage are some of the most critical aspects of testing. If I'm a test manager or a test lead or a test engineer and I do not know what level of my requirement coverage is or what level of code coverage is, then I don't know if I tested enough or not. Explicitly, knowing how much of the requirement has been tested or knowing how well did I test the requirement or how deep did I test the requirement, that is requirement coverage. Another related question is, if we're supposed to design tests, do we know what it means to design tests? Most people say we design tests based on requirements. This is like a construction engineer or a mechanical engineer saying, I designed the machine using blueprints. That's about it. Is that really what design means? What does test design mean? And we'll get to talk about that too. If we do not understand what test design really means, then we're not designing tests. Okay. And sometimes I even ask people to tell me any test design technique. But go ahead and share with me your thoughts. Name one test design technique you have ever used. Now of course, a lot of people say things like, we use requirement-based testing. Well, requirement-based testing, that's not a technique. Some people say we use use cases. I say, okay, how do you use use cases as a technique to design tests? And some more experienced people say things like, we used decision tables, we used equivalence class partitioning, we used pairwise test design, and those are techniques. Let me tell you this, if we do not understand test design techniques, then we do not know how to design tests. Certainly we can do a reasonable job in designing the tests without using techniques. But certainly the techniques will help us make our test design much more thorough, as I'm going to show you. All right, here's a slide about me. Hopefully you'd have a reason why you have to listen to me for the next 3 hours. Some of you who have already listened to my webinars know who I am. I've just been around for a while. I've done a lot in software engineering and software QA and testing. I've worked in all levels of projects, and I learned things. I'm not any better than any one of you. The only difference is that I managed to learn things from all projects I worked on, from bad projects and from good projects. And every one of us should be like that. So I happen to learn what makes a project good and what makes a project bad. I'm sharing those experiences with you. None of this stuff I'm going to be talking with you about exists in textbooks. The assumption is that you're here with me today for 3 hours to listen to my experience. And hopefully I will be able to tell you things that you did not already know, and will be able to tell you things that you could use in your projects. My goal is to give you 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that you could go tomorrow using them in your current project. This is my goal for the webinar. This is normally my goal when I teach any course. So what does IIST do? This is a slide that shows the different certifications from the International Institute for Software Testing. Please do not think that I'm trying to do a sales pitch here. It's odd when you listen to a 3 hours webinar from an organization you don't even know what they do. As you can see here, IIST has a total of 8 different certifications. I'm just going to tell you this. What is unique about certifications from IIST as opposed to any other certifications you might hear about from anywhere else is that IIST believes in education. And I do believe in education as the only way to create a career. No career without education. Keep that in mind. So, before we believe in education, all these certifications are what we call education-based. You need to actually attend the courses and participate in workshops, whether they are online or in class. And you need to take an exam for each one of the courses. And when you complete the courses required for any one of the certifications and you demonstrate that you have been able to use this knowledge in a project, then you get certified. That's why people come to IIST not only to be certified, but rather to learn things that can help them do a better job in their projects. This is our goal in every course we teach. All this is explained on the website, and I do not want to waste your time with that. I just wanted to give you an idea about what IIST does. All right, here's our agenda for the day. There are 10 practices. Let's start with the first one. I think that goes without saying. Do not test without requirements. Well, some people say, well, Magdi, it is easy for you to say. But we cannot stick to that because very often we get things we're supposed to test and we don't have requirements for. Well, that's not good. That's not good. Because if I were to ask you, what are some of your objectives or some of your goals when you do testing? When I ask this question in my course, Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design, The most common answer to this question is that I am trying to make sure requirements are met, or I'm trying to make sure the system works as expected, or I'm trying to make sure that the system meets the requirements, things along those lines. Well, if that is what you're trying to do, so how could you possibly achieve that goal without knowing what the requirements are? So we need to know what those requirements are. At the top here, I say you cannot test what you do not know, period. Even if I give you a requirement, but there are some details, some missing details in that requirement, you cannot test those details. If there is one single tiny thing missing in the requirement, I cannot expect a tester to test it, because we can't test what we don't know. So what do we use? What do we do? Of course, the answer to this question, I answer it in much more elaboration in my courses and the other courses by IST. But at the very least, if we're not given requirements, we are given some user interface. We are given some user interface. So you started testing based on the user interface. And in one of the courses I personally teach, which is designing and executing tests for agile projects, I assume sometimes that in an agile project or a non-agile project, it doesn't matter, you may not have requirements. And all what you were given is that the screens, the user interface, and you're supposed to test that. And my recommendation is that do not test the user interface itself. Your responsibility is to test the requirements behind the user interface. So you must use the user interface to discover the requirements that were not given to you. Even if you were given some level of details in the requirements, all the missing details, you need to discover them from the user interface. How do you do that? Well, it's a very simple structured method to do it. You go and look, for example, for a drop-down list. You see a drop-down. And you say, okay, when I test, I'm supposed to select one of the items in that drop-down list. Let me see what the items are. Do I know the meaning of each one of those items? Do I know the rules associated with each one of those? Okay. If I give you one of the screens to test, and that screen happened to be from a requirement management tool. Now I hope I'm not confusing you. So just because I was just looking at the Romana software before I started the webinar. And one of on the screen, on the requirement screen, there is a drop-down list. And the label on the drop-down list says status of the requirement. And if I were to test that screen and I were to select one of the status, and I enter a requirement or I change one of the status of one of the requirements to something else, I have not tested. You know that. Why? Because the truth is every item under the drop-down list has some rules associated with it, has some requirements associated with it. And my goal is to test those requirements. So I have to click on that drop-down list and see the list of items, and I see something that says under negotiation. All right. Do I know if I change the status of the requirements to be under negotiation what that means? Well, I need to understand that. I need someone to tell me that under negotiation means that people can collaborate and elaborate on this requirement. This requirement has not been finalized yet. And some of the forms of collaboration is that they may post a question about the requirement. All right. It means that if I change the status to under negotiation, I need to make sure that people are able to collaborate about that requirement. and people are able to ask questions and someone is able to answer those questions. If I have not tested that ability, then I did not test the status of the requirements. And someone says, okay, what other status would not make it possible for people to collaborate about the requirements? I can see something say baseline, I can see something else called finalized, whatever. Say, okay, what does finalized mean? I need someone to tell me that when the status of the requirement changes to finalized, that means that people cannot collaborate or change it anymore. In fact, at least they may be able to collaborate but not to change it. All right, I need to test that. This is kind of a business rule. I'm glad I mentioned the term. So one of your objectives when you do testing is to discover all the business rules associated with a given item on the screen, or all the business rules that are associated with a given requirement, because those business rules are also other requirements. So the business rule I'm speaking about here is once the status of the requirement changes to finalized, you may be able to ask questions about it, but you may not be able to change it. Is this written anywhere in the requirement? No. Let me give you a simplified example. If you are in front of a screen that you're supposed to be able to test canceling an order, and one of the fields on the screen is a drop-down list that says the status of the order, or actually nothing on the screen that shows what the status is, because the system knows what the status is. But there is a concept called the preconditions. I'm going to be talking about it in a little bit. When you are canceling an order, you need to know, has this order been shipped or not? Why do you need to know that? Because if the order was shipped, the cancellation process is very different from the case when the order is not shipped. So the bottom line here is I'm asking you to analyze the user interface, ask a lot of questions, and the answers to those questions will give you a lot of ideas to test. But that's, again, that's a situation, that's a desperate situation. That's a desperate situation. You're trying to test without requirements. But let me tell you this. In every project you're involved in, you are in a desperate situation. Because even when you are given requirements, I hope you believe me when I tell you that those requirements are never detailed enough. Those requirements are missing lots of details, and you are trying hard to find those details. We all know that some development projects use approaches like Agile, prototyping, RAD, which stands for Rapid Application Development. I just want you to pay attention to those, because all those approaches, what they do is they give some excuse to requirement writers and especially also developers to go very light on requirements. Why? Well, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, for example, which I know some people kind of blame me for taking it word by word, but I don't have any other source to go to. The Agile Manifesto says we value working systems over comprehensive documentation. We value working systems over comprehensive documentation. And some people took this literally and used it as an excuse not to write detailed requirements. That's why we started to see the whole thing about user stories in Agile projects. But please, don't get me wrong. User stories can be bad and can be good, like anything else, like any other practice. It depends on how we do it. Some people use user stories in Agile projects because they're simple and sweet and short, and we don't have to write too much. And more explicitly, some people use the user stories because they say they are stories to be told, not to be written. So in user stories, we don't write a lot, but we talk much more. A lot of people who use user stories believe in talking than writing. I don't believe in that. I don't know how talking can help us do the job. And of course, the people who believes in more talking than writing, they're speaking about some bad practices that said, we have written requirements all our lives. We have seen very large requirement documents, but those were not easy to understand. These were very difficult to understand. I say that's true too. No one said you have to write those kinds of documents either. But don't get me wrong, because some people use user stories in a very good way, and they provide some more of verification criteria or implementation criteria or something that says these are more details on that user story. When James Martin introduced the rapid application development approach back in the late 80s, 1987, 88, he did not know that software engineers will misuse it. And we did. We misused it. We got excited about the fact that we can build applications very quick. It's rapid application development. We got excited about not having to write long and lengthy requirements. And we started to use those prototypes, which are simply screen mockups. And the screen mockups are simply telling the users, here's what we're going to be building for you. Do you like it? And the user may say, oh yeah, I like it, but please, let's make this change here. Let's make this change there. I am not speaking against prototyping and RAMs. I'm only speaking against them if they are being used as an excuse not to write requirements. And they are very often. Unless whoever is running the project is a true software engineer, and he or she says, yes, we will use prototyping, yes, we will use RAD or Agile, but we need to make sure that our requirements are complete. The bottom line is, as test engineers, as test professionals, we have a lot of challenge to work with requirements because most requirements are not clear and are not precise. So what do? Here's my second practice. We need to get involved with the requirement process as early as possible. Again, that goes without saying. Well, if your project is an Agile project, then you are lucky. Why? Because it comes with the package. With the package of Agile, it comes the fact that QA and testing people are always involved with the requirement process very early. In fact, you probably know that if you worked on an Agile project, it's called the Agile team. And the Agile team works together from day one. And the Agile team has a requirement writer who might be a business analyst or who might be a product owner or a product manager. It also has a QA and testing person or people. It has the developers, and we work together. Believe it or not, I still heard about some Agile projects that do not bring the test team early in the project. In which case I say, whoever is running that project has no clue about Agile and has no clue about software engineering in general, has no clue about anything, and should not be let to run the project. I am saying this at the risk of upsetting some people who might be with me on this webinar today, but honestly speaking. if you're running an agile project, if you're running any project, let's put it this way, and you don't believe that QA and test team must be involved with the project as early as possible during the requirement process, then you're doing the very, very wrong thing. And I suggested that you better consult with someone else who's got experience running those kind of projects. Because we only lose. We lose when testing and QA is not involved in the requirement process early enough. And we can only gain if we get them involved as early as possible. That goes without saying. That goes without saying. If you think about any engineering project we do, if you think about building a house or building a large building, the people who are going to inspect the building are involved from the beginning. How? They are involved through the permit process. They know what needs to be done, and they sometimes dictate what must be done. You can't just leave those inspection people outside the picture and expect them to come at the end after the building is completed and expect them to do a good job in inspecting the building. So anyway, although the analogy is not very accurate, but still applies. Get involved with the requirement process as early as possible. Please, if you're currently attending requirement review meetings, or if you're currently participating in the requirement process as a QA person, as a tester, please go ahead and raise your hands. I want to see roughly how many people. Chris, Crystal, Debbie, Judy, Kristen, Leslie, and Lydia, Nikolai, and Paula. Okay. For those of you who did not raise their hands, which means you are not currently involved in the requirements process, you're not actively participating in the requirements process, I can tell you that there is a problem right there. Unless you tell me that you're not doing testing or QA. If you are testing in the project, then the assumption is you are involved in the requirement process as early as possible. And if you are not, then there is something wrong. And I'm sorry to say that whatever is wrong not necessarily with you, but with management. Because management did not believe that you should be involved in the requirement process as early as possible. It's some level of ignorance, if you will. But let me put some blame on you. The reason that management did not believe that it is very critical that me as a tester, I should be involved in the requirement process as early as possible. The reason they did not believe that is because I did not give them reason to believe that it is so critical for me to be part of the requirement process. I gave them all reasons to exclude me. How is that? I have not shown my value, the value that I can bring to the process. And of course, some people say, how can I show a value to the requirement process if I'm not even part of it? Sure you can. It's like everything else. I mean, you work with those requirements after they have been written, or you test those applications after they have been developed. You must do things to show the person running the show, whether he or she is, the development manager, the project manager, the product owner, whoever he or she is, you must do things to show them that they made a big mistake by not including you in the requirement process. They made a big mistake by not bringing you early enough. How do you do that? I'll show you in a little bit. There are so many things we can do. Achieving this goal of getting involved with the requirement process as early as possible is never going to be happening by talking to management or by trying to convince management that we need to be a part of the requirement process. No. It will only happen by doing things to show management that they made the big mistake. Let me share with you some of the things you can do. Nikolai says, I talk to developers and participate in design reviews. I didn't speak about design reviews. I was talking about requirement reviews. And Judy says, I provide input to team regarding the requirement document. I like that. However, the question remains, what kind of input you provide? Susan says, I ask you questions and make sure the requirement being put together is testable. Very good, Susan, although we want to talk about what it means for a requirement to be testable, because that's a very hard question, because what you think is not testable might be actually testable in my own opinion. But yes, Susan, what you're talking about is good in its own. And the Chris comes back and say, I get clarification on requirements, and I like what Nikolai says again. I learned customer expectations and practices. All right, few good things. Note that. Let's find out what you really are supposed to do. I make it clear. It is not that easy to get involved in the requirement process as early as possible. You can try to convince management, but very few management will listen, especially if you're not convincing enough. You can talk with developers if you want, and analysts, to try to learn things, as some of you said. But talking needs to be done in a structured way, and I'll show you how to do this in a bit. You can learn in the language that developers speak, you can learn in the language that analysts speak and customers speak. That's why Nikolai says, I'm trying to learn about customer expectations. But here's some of the most effective ways. Use techniques and methods to help you do a good job in participating in the requirement process. These are things that we already know. They are out there in the literature, okay? But we don't use them. And I will show you an example of one of them. But see the bottom one here. Let me put this in. Most importantly, show contribution. Show the value. Make them feel your presence. Show what kind of value can you bring to the process. Any meeting you attend, if people do not see the value you can bring, no one will care if you are there or not. You want to be the person that they wait for you and not start the meeting before you show up. Now, this is a lot to expect of you, right? But yeah, I've seen a lot of QA people like that who are effective enough to the point that when there is a requirement meeting, they cannot start the meeting without the person. Of course, they will eventually start the meeting, but they will wait a few minutes. All right? Let me show you how you do this. Let's pretend for the moment that we are actually reviewing this requirement. I want you to look at this requirement for a few minutes. And of course, it's unreasonable to give you requirements that you can review in a few minutes. Go ahead and look at the requirement and tell me if you were to be given this requirement. what kind of questions would you ask? What kind of questions would you ask? I want to see how effective you are in asking the questions. How good questions do you ask? Are you right to the point or not? I'll leave it with you for a few minutes here. The requirement says simply, well, the system is good. This is a part of a bigger and bigger requirement. The requirement says the system will determine whether a person qualifies for a complementary first-class upgrade or not. And the system will determine that based on a number of factors. Mostly it is the status, the elite status of the customer. If the customer is a gold or silver status, okay, if they are gold or silver members of the loyalty program, they could upgrade to first class if there is a first class available. But they must also have been placed in the waiting list to be upgraded. Now, see, I'm explaining some of the things here. It says here, not unless they are not placed in the waiting list, but it doesn't say what waiting list. If the customer is a platinum elite member, they can also upgrade a companion. Okay. So this requirement is written by someone who claimed that this is a good requirement. And I believe it was Susan, I believe so, who said, I want to make sure that the requirement is testable. And I will ask Susan now, is this requirement testable? And if not, why not? So go ahead and provide me with your questions, just to pretend that you are reviewing this requirement to be able to test it. I want to hear your questions. Okay, let's hear what Tammy is saying. Tammy is saying too many pieces to the requirement needs to be broken down. I think you need a little more detail. Tammy, I agree with you 100%. But I'm asking you, what kind of details do you need? If you need to break it down, break it down. It's your job. Forgive me. It's your job. However, be careful here. Don't criticize my requirement. You know what I mean. I'm your business analyst who has been trained to write requirements and have written this requirement, and I believe this requirement is good. So don't tell me anything to make me believe that, to the effect that I don't know how to write requirements. So I know you did not. I honestly know that you did not say anything, but I'm using this as a warning to all of us. Too many pieces to the requirement needs to be broken down. That's okay. That's your opinion. Go ahead and break it down. And if you're telling me I'm missing a lot of details, I might look at this and say, I don't know what I'm missing though. Tell me what you want. Now, question from Susan, and remember, Susan is the one who said that she wants to make sure the requirement is testable. She asked a question: how is the person identified as a gold or silver or elite member? Good question, Tammy, but the answer is simple. It's a status that every customer has. Some people do not travel as often, so they're nothing. And some people like me who travel every week, I'm a diamond member. When I log into the system to check into the flight, the system knows that I'm a diamond member based on my my loyalty number. So if that's your question, how does the system identify a person? It's every person has a number to enter, which is called the elite number. If I enter my elite number, the system will know that I'm a diamond. If you enter your elite number, the system will know that you're platinum, and so on. And if I don't have an elite number to enter, then I am not platinum or gold or silver or anything. Another question from Judy says, if I got those requirements, I would wait for the design team to provide the call flow for it. That would clearly show what the requirements are. What do you guys think of that? If you get this requirement, you wait for the design team to provide the call flow. Let's just pretend for the moment that I am your design team. And you can go ahead and wait for me. And I'm not providing you with anything. And if you come to me and say, where is the call flow? I'm assuming that I'm reading this correctly. I say call flow for what? Please. I know you're using terminology that's probably recognized in your environment. But I say, what call flow? I don't do call flow. I work from the requirements. I'm an agile guy. I work from the requirements. So I'm sorry, Judy, to tell you that your strategy may not work to wait for developers to provide the call flow. And what if you wait? Of course, there's a problem with waiting because you don't even know when I'm going to be providing that call flow to you. That's very late. You want to start with your design, your test design, as early as possible when you get the requirements. So please provide more insight about your strategy here. Okay. Lisa says, does this flight apply to domestic or international? Is there a difference? And thank you, Lisa. No, there is no difference. This requirement applies to both domestic and international. Another question says, upgrade requirements are not clear. Again, you exactly are doing, I'm going to just say Bala as a short for your name. Is that really your name? Or the system kind of screws things up? Forgive me, it's a pretty long name that I have no way. It has 27 characters here. More. So I'm not going to pronounce your name so that I don't make fool of myself. But you're saying upgrade requirements are not clear. You just did what I said don't do. You criticized my requirement. If I'm your business analyst for this requirement, I will come and say what's not clear about it. So it doesn't help anybody to tell me that my requirements are not clear. I know you continue to say, for example, is the upgrade free? Well, I'm sorry, you did not listen. Forgive me, please. I'm not directing the discussion to you. I'm directing my talk to everyone who can possibly make this kind of comment. So he says, is the upgrade free? I'm going to say, you did not listen to what I said. Because when I explained my requirements, I said, this is a complementary requirement. Sorry, a complementary upgrade. So it is free. So the note is for everyone else. And I'm glad that people cannot see your names, by the way. So the point being made here is that don't ask a question about information that has already been provided to you. I know it's not provided in the requirement, but I already said it. It's just a complementary upgrade. All right. Lisa asked the question, says, what determines a gold and what determines silver? Okay, Lisa, those are loyalty. This is a loyalty program that people acquire those status based on how often they travel. So allow me, Lisa, to say that this kind of question would be slightly outside the scope of this requirement, because in this requirement we are not trying to determine how a person becomes a gold or silver or platinum. We only know that there are steps. Some people are gold, some people are silver, and some people are platinum. And how do they become one? This is a different, that is our loyalty program based on how many times, how often they travel, and things like that. So we're not getting into what determines a gold or silver. At least not part of this requirement. We know that. Judy, I'm sorry. I got a question here. Says, what is the software supposed to do? I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say, what? And you say, what is the software supposed to do? I say, it's supposed to do what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to do the requirement that's written in front of you. Again, I hope no one here would take any comment I make personal. I'm not talking to anyone personally here. I'm trying to see the kind of comments that comes out of people in a review process. And I'm trying to deal with those comments in a way that helps you improve the way you do things. If I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm presenting this requirement, and I get someone saying, what is the software supposed to do? I'm hoping I understood this question correctly. To be honest with you, if this question is being asked, everyone is going to look at you. So what? What do you mean, what is the software supposed to do? We're looking at the requirement and you're asking the question, what is the software supposed to do? The software is supposed to do this requirement. That's what we're here for. Okay. I hope I did not dwell on this too much. If I misunderstood your question, I intentionally did not want to say the name here. If I did not understand your question, please clarify. And Tammy responded to the issue about the call flow, which I believe okay, someone, I don't need to recall the name. Someone said, I'm going to wait for developers to provide call flow, and I commented on that. And Tammy said, call flow does not reveal requirements, it reveals design. And Tammy is right. So you can wait for the call flow if you ever get it. And when you get it, you're not going to see the requirements. And it will not answer a lot of questions. That's assuming that your developer is going to do it and give it to you on time. All right, Leslie says, if Platinum, do they have to be on the waiting list? That is a good question, Leslie. It is a good question because, I mean, for the first time I'm seeing a question here that's about missing tickets. Tammy is asking, if the person is Platinum, do they have to be in the waiting list to be upgraded? And I go as a business analyst and look back at my requirements and say, no, you're right. No, they don't have to be in the waiting list. So that's why I did not say anything about they have to be in the waiting list. So it looks like, or I could have said the other way around. I could have said, oh yes, they have to be in the waiting list like everyone else. And if I say that, then Leslie would say, all right, but the requirement does not say that. Sure, and that would be very legitimate argument. Nikolai says, I can create a test case for this requirement. I'm not sure if Nikolai says I can or I cannot. I'm going to take it in the positive way that I'm hearing that I can create a test case for this requirement. Really? Can you? I can't. I am the one who wrote this requirement, and I cannot create a test case for this requirement. So be careful here. In fact, if you ever approach this requirement and you try to write test case, you're making the biggest mistake. Because we're trying to find out if this requirement can be tested. And let me tell you that every requirement you get is never testable. If I tell you the characteristics of testable requirements, you'd be amazed. This requirement largely not testable. Most people would make the biggest mistake of their life by going and taking the requirement like this and try to design tests. If you've seen my courses, in my courses I have a chart, in all my courses I have the chart. So the chart's simply saying, don't ever take requirements and design tests for it. Requirement-based testing is a ticket for failure. That's all what it is. If you take a requirement and write test cases on it, it doesn't matter what the requirement is, it does not matter who wrote the requirement, you will fail. Absolutely. Now I know this is a very strong statement, but I'm making it based on my experience. Every time people took requirements and wrote test cases for it, they failed. Every time people took user stories and wrote test cases for them, they failed. Why? Because requirements and user stories and everything else, none of them is complete enough, is unambiguous enough. None of them is consistent enough. None of them is detailed enough to be tested. So I am submitting now that no requirement, including the ones I write, is testable. No requirement is testable. So someone says, so what are we going to do? We'll do a lot of things. The first thing at first is to ask the questions. Absolutely. But asking the questions is not going to just cut it. The purpose of asking questions and clarifying things is to bring the requirement to become a little bit more testable than what it is. But then we're going to go to the next step, which is building other things. So let me show you what do we build here. So here's the first thing we're going to do. So after you ask all your questions, you start taking the requirements. And I believe Tammy said there's so much in that requirement, and it needs to be broken down. And if you remember, I asked Tammy, I said, go ahead, break it down. Susan asked the question, is there a limitation on how many companions you can upgrade? And the answer is yes, it's only one companion. Okay, then Tammy says, do requirements already exist to define customers, loyalty programs, and waiting lists? What does the software do if the ticket agent intervenes? Well, Tammy, you're asking a lot of good questions, though. Yes or no? Do requirements exist to define customers? No, but customers are those who purchase tickets. Loyalty programs, yes, because loyalty program is a different system, and we have requirements to define everything there. Is there any other requirement that defines a waiting list? And Tammy's trying to ask her question in a very politically correct way. She does not want to tell me in my face that you have a lousy requirement. She's telling me that, okay, I'll accept your requirement if you tell me there are other places where those things are defined. She's putting she's putting everything back on my shoulder, and I have to look and say, oh no, the waiting list. No, there is no requirement that defines the waiting list. But what do you want to know about the waiting list? Then I can start asking my question. I can start answering your questions. All right. So going back to what Tammy said earlier about breaking the requirements. Okay. So here's my approach, and I'm going to give you, this is a method I want you to know. Here's my approach. You take the requirements. Every requirement will be broken down, but every requirement will be broken down differently. This requirement, because it tells me that the system will do certain things based on other things, I'm going to break it down in this way. So if you look at the things that I put in a yellow color, customer is a gold or silver. First class is available. Unless they were not placed in the waiting list. Customer is platinum. What am I pulling out here? I'm curious to see, what would you call those things? I'm curious to know what some of you would possibly call them. Go ahead, tell me what do you call those things that I put in the yellow color? I just want to hear it from you. Of course, I'll tell you what they are. But I want to make sure that we all understand. Okay, Leslie says I call them conditions. Swapna says, hello Swapna, good to hear from you. Swapna says scenarios. Well, not sure the scenarios yet, because we're going to understand scenarios in a little bit. They're conditions. They're things. Tammy says they are states. I'll take this as a sophisticated term, Tammy. Lisa says they are actors. Well, I appreciate the sophistication again, because the actor model is a very sophisticated model that we teach in software engineering. But actors are things that act. And I don't think being in the waiting list or not is an actor. Okay, and I don't think a first-class seat is available is an actor. The closest answer here are conditions that Leslie said. But you know what are they? They are things. Funny enough. They are things that can possibly cause the system to do something different. We know that if the customer is gold or silver elite member, the system is going to do something. We know if the first-class seat is available or not available, the system will do something. And we also know that if the person is not in the waiting list, something is going to happen. That's why Leslie called them conditions. If Leslie agrees with me and everyone else agrees with me, I'm going to call those causes. I'm going to call them causes because they're going to cause the system to do something different. So what you're trying to do now is to take a requirement, break it down into causes. You say this, what could possibly cause the system to do something different? And you start underlining or circling anything you believe can cause the system to act differently. And now if you look at the things I put in blue color, it's easy to know what those are. So the first one says the person could upgrade to first class. They are asked to see ticketations. Or the member could upgrade the companion. It looks like those are the things that the system will do as a result of one or more of the other things that would cause the system to do things. I keep using the word things a lot. Because they are the things, they are a result of the causes, we're going to call them effects. Now we have causes and we have effects. I'm hearing from someone says, I guess this thing isn't working. I don't know what thing you're referring to. Winnie, elaborate. Everyone else can see me, right? They can see the slides, can hear me. Thank you, Leslie. So thanks, Chris, thanks, Susan. All right. I'm just I wanna be kind of observing what people. Oh. So you said you asked the question earlier, but I never confirmed. Well, I have so many questions in front of me, so my apology. So I'm gonna go back quick in your question. I guess you're right. You're okay. Here you go. Is that your question? Is the customer given the option to upgrade or not? If that's your question, the answer is yes. I'm sorry, I did not answer every single question. I hope you all realize that. I just selected some questions. I have so many questions that if I go through all of them, I would not have the time. So hopefully I did answer that, right? Let me know. Okay. It is working fine. The question is displayed. Your question has been received. It's just I didn't have time to answer all questions. All right, so now we have two things, and that's in every requirement. We have things that can cause the system to do things, and we're going to call those causes. And we have things that the system will do as a result of some of those causes, and we're going to call them effects. So, and as a result, you listed them like that. So I have now 4 causes and the 3 effects. Now, this is my way of breaking down the requirements. And this is the first thing to understand, to see if I really got this requirement clear or not. Okay, I know now if the customer is silver or gold elite member, that would cause something to happen. And I'm not going to think yet about what it would happen, because that by itself may not mean much. So here's another one. The customer is platinum, and the first class is available, and the customer is on the waiting list. Okay, and there are 3 things here the system could potentially do. The customer may upgrade to first class, the companion upgrade to first class, or the customer is asked to see ticket agent. And now you have to ask yourself the question: are there any other things? Are there any other causes that can cause the system to do something else? Is this requirement missing any other causes? Because if it is, then we need to find out those. So at the very least, I need to ask my business analyst, says, are these the only factors that determine complementary upgrade to first class? Do we include, for example, anything about the ticket of the price of the ticket? Is there a time limitation? Can people upgrade within a certain time frame? And I believe we heard that question from someone that says, does it matter if the flight is domestic or international? Because we might find other things. Well, what if the business analyst comes back and says, oh, but be careful here, because if the person paid for their ticket what we call a full coach price, which normally is a very high price, close enough to the price of first class. If the person paid a full coach, then we upgrade them regardless of their status. Oh, okay. Then it looks like we have another cause that's missing here. All right. So once you identify cause and effects, what's next? You start saying, okay, what combination of these causes would cause which effects? Is it reasonable to say that if the customer is a silver or gold elite member, he or she would be upgraded to first class? Meaning that if this is true, then that's what's going to happen? No. No. Because for the customer to be silver or gold by itself does not qualify them for upgrades. Because there are other things that needed to be true, like there's a first class seat available, like the customer is in the waiting list. And what if the customer is not waiting in the waiting list? Well, we are asked to see ticket agent. So we'll find that there are so many combinations of causes that lead to different effects. So we need to find an effective way to cover all the possible combinations. And here's the effective way I'm talking about. It is called decision table. Okay? I don't know how many of you have ever used decision tables, and how many of you have used decision tables in this manner. Because guess what? Decision tables have been in the literature for years. In fact, they first appeared in the first book written in software testing by Glenn Ford Myers in 1979. And not too many people use them. In fact, let me ask, how many of you have used decision tables before? If you have used decision tables before, please raise your hand. Tammy is only one out of 32. This is like 3%. 3%, thank you, Tim. 3% of population use a technique like decision table. What's our excuse? Decision table has been in the literature for over 40 years. What are we talking about? For 35 years. Now, I know someone was going to say, they are difficult to use. Well, let's together here find out, is decision tables really difficult to use? We'll find out. You already know more than 60% of what decision tables are. Decision tables, the way I teach them, I think we need to teach techniques in a way that people can use them. So again, why are we not using them? So let's continue here to see how simple they are. So what you have here is a list of causes on the top of the table and a list of effects at the bottom. And we need to think about all the possible combinations of causes that can lead to certain effects. And here is a simple question we must answer. If I have 4 possible causes, how many possible combinations do I have? All right, so the answer is 2 to the power 4, and the 2 comes from the fact that it is either yes or no. Each one of the 4 things could be either yes or no, and that's where the 2 coming from. And it's a 2 to the power 4 because of the 4 causes. So if I have 4 causes, then it's 2 to the power 4. If I only have 3 causes, then it is 2 to the power 3. If I had 5 causes, then it is 2 to the power 5. And that means that it's 2 times itself. 2 to the power 4 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And that's 16. And that's why I would have 16 possible combinations. If I had only 3 causes here, then I would have how many columns? 8. Because it's going to be 2 to the power 3. That's 2 times itself 3 times. Now, the bigger challenge here is that how do I come up with the 16 combinations? Very simple. If you look here, you'll find that the first row, I have 8 of them. So if you look here, I have the first row, half of them are yes, 8 yes here, and 8 no here. So that's the thing you do. You go to the first row and do an equal split, half yes and half no. And you go to the second row and you do a further split. Initially I had 4 yes here, now I have 4 yes and 4 no. And 4 yes and 4 no. Then I continue to do further split. I have 2 yes and 2 no, 2 yes, 2 no, and so on. 2 yes and 2 no. Then I do further split, 1 yes and 1 no. Your last row is going to be every other one. It's a very simple mechanical process by which you come up with the combinations. So now, once we come up with the combinations, the next step is to say, okay, let me decide, let me find out what the system is supposed to do in each one of those combinations. So for example, let me look at this. And of course, you're supposed to cover all the combinations, but I'm going to make my point very quick here. What does this say? What does this column say? It says a person is not gold or silver. The person is not platinum. There is a first class seat available, and they are in the waiting list. The person is in the waiting list. So I got a person here who's not a silver or gold or platinum, not an elite member. They are in the waiting list. And there is a first class seat available. Do we upgrade that person or not? Did the requirement say anything? Did the requirement say anything about it? No. What happened? Well, the person who wrote the requirement forgot it completely. In fact, no one who writes requirements, including myself, would have remembered to talk about this, would have remembered to write enough details in the requirement to address a situation like that. And no one who is reviewing the requirement, when we were sitting down and looking at this requirement and trying to ask questions, no one would have discovered this incompleteness or would have discovered this missing details in the requirements. So now we're starting to discover problems with the requirements that we would never discover as we are looking at the requirement and reviewing it. Those are the kind of questions I want you to ask. Remember, the purpose of our discussion from the beginning is that I wanted you to be the kind of person who is very effective, that they like to see you in meetings. I like you to go and send that question or bring that question to the meeting and say, guys, what's going to happen in a situation like this? And if you find 3 or 4 like that, those are the kind of questions that need to be asked in the meeting. Okay? Not the trivial questions, like, of course, does this apply to domestic or international? This is a reasonable question, and it needed to be asked. But those are the kind of questions that no one can see. I mean, people, imagine now, if your developers have taken that requirement, and they have written the code, and after they wrote the code, you came up with this question, and you say, what's supposed to happen here? Oh, they're going to go in like says, I don't know how the system does it. I don't even know how the system handles a situation like that. And there are so many other situations. Okay, to make this long story short, I'm going to go to the next slide here, and here is here's how the table looks like. The question marks here means that I don't know. The requirement didn't tell me. The requirement didn't tell me if the person was not gold or silver or platinum and there is no first-class seat available, but they are in the waiting list. The requirement didn't say anything about that. The requirement didn't say anything about if the person is not gold or silver or platinum and there is a first-class seat available and he or she is in the waiting list. The requirement didn't tell me that. The requirement didn't tell me that if the person is platinum and there is a first-class seat available, but they are not, but he is not in the waiting list. Now, what are those first 4 columns that I left blank? Those are the columns that Tammy just kind of addressed in her recent question here. Tammy had a question that says, but not all values need to be tested. And that is true. Well, before I say that, let me ask you a question. And I'm expecting an answer from anyone. What should the system do here in a situation like this? Please go ahead and communicate your answer to me. What do you think the system should do here in the first column? I'm leaving it blank because I don't know what to put there. What should the system do? If the person is gold or silver and the platinum, and there is a first-class seat available, and the person is in the waiting list. We should say must be an error message. Customer cannot be all type of customer at the same time. Now, Lisa, I agree with you 100% with the second part of your answer. Customer cannot be all types at the same time. And because of that, you cannot test it. And that's why there shouldn't be an error message. There will not be an error message because you will not be able to try this test. You will not be able to come up with a customer who's gold or silver and also platinum at the same time. So instead of saying there will be an error message, we say that's not something to be tested. We call this illogical scenario, illogical situation. As a result, we call those scenarios illogical scenarios. We call them illogical scenarios, and we do not test them. When I say illogical scenarios, sometimes people come and say, oh, but we still have to test them, right? No, you can't test them. Because I say the data is not right. Well, you're kind of right. If I have a situation like this in the database, then my database is screwed up. But you can't. If you have a database design that there is a column in the customer field, in the customer table, that says status, that status can only have one value. It can be either this or this or that. You cannot have wrong data. Tammy is saying if there are multiple customers that meet the criteria for the erroneous scenarios, the software should fall out during the data input, not in functional testing. And let me clarify things here. We test based on data that's sitting in our database. The conditions of the data in the database is in a certain state. And I believe, Tammy, you're the one who used the word states. So, and what I am arguing and what Lisa and others are arguing is that that state where a person is in the database, that both gold and silver and platinum, that's invalid state. And we should never have that state. You're saying it should fall during data entry, not during functional testing. I'm not convinced that these are two different things, but there is no data entry. Okay? There is no data entry. No one entered the status. The status is a precondition. The status is stored in the system. And what I am saying is that I should never, ever have a situation where I have a customer sitting in the database that he or she is a gold or silver and a platinum at the same time. How could it possibly happen? In the database, we have a table called the customer, and there is one column called status. And in databases, if column has single value, it would have either platinum or gold or silver. So the situation we're talking about is not an error situation. It's not an error message that will be displayed anytime. It's an illogical situation. It's an invalid state of the database that we will never reach. I can challenge anybody to tell me that they can go and store information about a customer that has multiple status. How could you do this if the field called status is a single valued field? Okay, I'll have to stop here. I think we already discussed enough about that. All right, so the conclusion here is that we need to do this decision table, and this is just one of the techniques. It's one of the techniques I teach in our classes. All right, and the technique will uncover so many problems with the requirements. And that's how you become involved in the requirements process as early as possible. Now, we are into the third commandment, formally design your tests. And I explicitly use the word formally to avoid any misunderstanding here. Because everyone seems to believe that we are designing tests. Not necessarily. In fact, there is this misconception out there that mixes test design with test planning. For many people, they're not clear about what's the difference between test design and test planning. We plan our tests, and I say, planning for your tests is different from designing your tests. The IEEE, long time ago, made it very clear and made the distinction between test planning versus test design. Let me just very briefly tell you, test planning or planning tests are those activities that have to do with determining what environment we're going to be running the tests in, what are we testing and what we are not testing, our approach and the strategy for testing, when are we going to start the testing and when are we going to finish, and when are we going to do certain things, that's timeline stuff. Who is going to do what exactly? And this is the concept of resources. All right? What if certain things happen that would hinder us from doing what we're supposed to do? How are we going to deal with those? And that's the risk stuff, the risk analysis in system management. As you can see, all those activities are very typical of any project, whether it is a testing project or not. That is what test planning is all about. Test design is different. Formally design your tests. What does it mean? Well, designing your tests, in my opinion, has two components to it. One of them is you must use a test design methodology. What is a test design methodology? It's a step-by-step of a process that tells me how I design a test. It's a methodology that must be taught to everybody who's designing the tests, such that we all do it the same way. The current state of practice is terrible because different people look at requirements differently. You give me one requirement, and I look at it, and I design tests for it, and you take the same requirement to give it to someone else, he or she looks at it, she designs tests on it. There's no way that we know that we tested the same thing. You almost want to say, let's combine my tests with your tests to make sure that we're covering everything. But we don't have that privilege. We don't have that kind of time. If we all follow the same test design methodology, then we will produce the same results. We will produce the same test cases, or at least close enough. Now, within that test design methodology, as I'm going to explain, there is also the concept of test design techniques. The decision table that I just covered in the previous practice is one of those techniques. But I did not show you yet how you would design tests based on decision tables. I only showed you how to analyze and elaborate on the requirements using the decision table. In a little bit, I will show you. So we saw decision table as a requirement elaboration technique. In a bit, we're going to see it as a test design technique. But there are other test design techniques that help you do things more effectively within a test design process or a test design methodology. So let me show you this methodology that I've been teaching people for the last maybe, 18 years now. As you can see, we start with the requirement. And it does not matter how detailed that requirement is. Of course, the more detailed the requirement is, the better job we can do. All right? The better job we can do in designing tests. If we don't have enough details in the requirement, then we're going to have a hard time. However, you can see strictly here that there is no line going directly from requirements to test cases. That's why when someone said, I can write a test case for that requirement, I said, be careful. Because if we already know that requirements are never complete, requirements are always ambiguous and inconsistent and missing details, why are we going to be taking those requirements and writing test cases for? The intermediate step here that I'm suggesting is the concept of scenarios. And I've been teaching people scenario-based test design for years. This is simply saying that we will take a requirement, and before we rush into writing test cases, we'll come up with scenarios. A requirement is any statement describing any functionality that's expected of the system. A scenario is any condition or any situation that could possibly happen in production. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a normal thing that happens. It could be abnormal thing. For example, the scenario we were talking about in the decision table, when I said a person is a gold, the person who's not a gold or silver or platinum and is in the waiting list, and there is a first-class seat available, this whole thing that I just described is a scenario. Why? Because it is a condition or a situation that could possibly happen in production. The other things I talked about when I said a person is not a gold or silver, the person is a platinum, but they are not in the waiting list, and there's a first-class seat available. That's another scenario. And when I said, here is a person who is both gold and silver and the platinum at the same time, that's another scenario. The only difference is that this last scenario is illogical. We already judged that. We said it's illogical. So someone says, hold on, Maggie, you said a scenario is a condition that could possibly happen. That's true, which means I'm excluding illogical ones. We are not interested in illogical scenarios because we're not going to test them. We cannot test them. But we are interested only in scenarios that could possibly happen in production. So as you can see now, if you were to combine or to look at the decision table in the context of this methodology, it looks like every column in the decision table is a possible scenario. So the decision table, as we looked at it, has 16 possible scenarios. However, 4 of those scenarios are illogical. So there are 12 other scenarios we must test. So here's an interesting thing. Someone says, oh, so does this mean that we have to use decision tables to come up with scenarios? Absolutely not. Decision tables just happen to be one of many techniques and methods by which we can come up with scenarios. Yet, it is very effective method, because there is no other method I know of that can give you all the scenarios within a requirement like that. In fact, let me rephrase this. Decision tables will give you scenarios you cannot see otherwise. I already told you that. For that scenario where the person was not gold or silver or platinum, but he is in the waiting list and there's a first-class seat available, if we sat in front of the requirement for a week looking at that requirement, we would never see that scenario. However, there are other scenarios that some of you have pointed out that have nothing to do with the decision table. So when someone asks, for example, is this requirement for both domestic and international, or there is a difference? And I answered, no difference. I said, no, it's applicable to both. Well, guess what? That question, when it was asked, and the answer when I provided it, that gives you 2 scenarios to test. And hopefully the person who asked that question now has in her mind or his mind to test one situation where a person is doing international tickets and the other one is doing domestic tickets. See, that's what I'm talking about. So questions and answers will also lead to scenarios. I don't have to use the decision tables all the time to build scenarios. In fact, most of the scenarios you're going to build them informally. But what's important here is this. How many scenarios can you come up with? We all agree, or at least we all can agree, that the more scenarios you can come up with, and the more scenarios you can explore, and the more scenarios you can document, the more testing you're going to be doing. And let me add, the more scenarios you have, the higher your requirement coverage is. So if you give a requirement, this answers our first question. Remember the first question I put in the beginning of the webinar? How do you know that a requirement has been reasonably tested? It's all based on the number of scenarios. If I take a requirement and come up with 15 scenarios, and Tammy takes the same requirement, and they come up with 30 scenarios, there is no doubt that requirement coverage for Tammy is double my requirement coverage. Tammy is testing much more of the requirement than me. She's testing at twice as much. That goes without saying. Of course, there is a possibility that Tammy added about 5 or 10 scenarios that are not very important, but it doesn't matter. The fact that they are scenarios that can happen in production and they can be tested, they need to be tested. It's important to be tested. The fact they're not important or not, I didn't test them. So what? Requirement coverage is critical. And the best indication I know of for requirement coverage is scenarios, the number of scenarios. In my course that I teach on best practices in software test planning and design, and some of you might remember that if you attended the course. I know a few of you attended the course. In that course, I ask people to break into groups and take a requirement and come up with scenarios. But what is important for me is this, is to look at those scenarios that people come up with and see how many of those scenarios are explicitly stated in the requirement and how many are not. And that really is a good measure of my effectiveness in test design. If someone says I came up with 15 scenarios, but those 15 scenarios are mentioned somewhere and addressed somewhere in the requirement, then that person did not do much. That person could have just went from requirements and written test cases directly. The advantage we have by going through the scenario is to be able to come up with scenarios that are not in the requirement. And when I ask teams in the classroom to tell me how many scenarios they came up with that were not part of the requirement, I see some amazing numbers. But of course, the numbers will always depend on the group and the team and the composition of the team. And I keep those numbers in a spreadsheet. Some teams say, I took the requirement, I came up with 40 scenarios. And I say, how many of those scenarios were not explicitly stated in the requirement? Were not explicitly stated in the requirement. They say 30. Only 10 were obvious in the requirement. 30 were not. Wow. That means that coming up with scenarios have allowed us to triple our requirement coverage. That's what I'm interested in. If I only tested based on requirements, if I did what we call pure requirement-based testing, we would have tested only 10 scenarios. Now, by following the scenario process, we are going to be testing 40 scenarios. Is that good or bad? I know some of you are going to say, no, it's bad, because we're not going to have time to test all that. That's a different story, though. I mean, if you don't have time to test, then just take the requirement and write as a few test cases and you're done. And we have no clue if you have tested the requirement or not. So building scenarios are very important. Once you finish this scenario, now you're going to take each scenario and you're going to start writing a group of test cases. So how are test cases different from scenarios? So what's the difference between scenarios and test cases? Because they seem to be similar. Well, here is my definition of a test case. And this is how different it is from a scenario. A test case, any test case, I don't care what methodology you're using, and I really truly do not care what tool you're using. You might be using Quality Center, you might be using any Jira or whatever it is, I don't care. A tool is not supposed to tell me my methodology. A tool is only a tool. A tool is supposed to help me implement my methodology. And in this methodology, here is the definition of a test case. If you don't like it, I'm okay with that. Just to find another methodology to use. Every test case, regardless, has to have input. And the input is what? Is everything you're supposed to give to the system in order to test it. Every test case. Now let me see if I have an elaborate diagram for that. Yes. Okay. So every test case has an input. What you see here is a black box you're trying to test. Every test case has input. Every test case has output, of course. Based on the input you give, there's output. But those are not the only two things in a test case. Every test case, regardless of what tool or what methodology you're using, must also have a list of preconditions. What are those? Preconditions are conditions that exist before you run the test case that will affect how the test case will be executed. And let me tell you this. In all our practices, we ignore preconditions. If I'm running a test case, for example, to test the automatic upgrades, sorry, the complementary upgrade to first class. Obviously, some of the preconditions I'm interested in is the person platinum or gold or silver? Is there a first class seat available? Right? Or is the person in the waiting list? Does the person have a companion or not? Why? Why am I listing those things? Because those are the things based on which the system will determine what to do. If I'm running a test case to cancel an order and refund the money, obviously some of the preconditions are what? The order exists. The order has not been canceled before. The order has been paid. The order has not been shipped. The credit card that was used to pay for the order is still valid. Is that the credit card we're going to refund? See, those are the preconditions. Every test case must have the preconditions. If you are writing test cases, but you are not explicitly listing those preconditions in your test case, you are not designing tests. So that's what designing tests means. Part of designing tests is to list the preconditions of every test case. Why? Because based on the input and the preconditions, the system will have post conditions and outputs. The system will have post conditions and output. So what are the post conditions? Well, we know what output is. An output is something like I can see on the screen, or I can print it on a piece of paper. So if nothing is being displayed on the screen, which in every test case there are things to be displayed on the screen. But very often we ignore the post conditions. Post conditions are changes to the database as a result of running the test. Okay, for example, the order has been canceled. The credit card has been refunded. These are post conditions. Okay, and the output is anything you can see on the screen. As a result, here are the definitions of those things. So going to get back to my definition of a test case. That's why I said a test case is input plus preconditions that will produce post conditions in the output. Of course, I don't have enough time to say all the kind of things I want to say. But this is what I teach in some of my courses, especially the course on best practices. I know some of you might think that I'm using this in order to sell the course. Well, if you want more details, I cannot help it. We're spending 3 hours together, but I'm not able to finish the whole webinar. Okay, and this webinar is a tiny bit of what we teach in courses. So that's why I cannot cover everything. All right. What are some of the techniques we can use? We already saw decision tables. There are also decision trees, which are the same concept of decision tables, but they are like a tree structure. There are equivalent class partitioning to help us determine what the test cases are. There are cause and effect graphs. There are use cases. All these techniques are available there. I did not invent any one of them. But you need to learn them in a way that allows you to use them. Let me ask a few questions here before we move to the next practice. How many of you would say, yes, in our test design process, we take requirements and we develop scenarios? We take requirements and we develop scenarios for those requirements. And we develop scenarios before we write our test cases. Go ahead and let me know. Don't raise your hand, but rather write me something that I can read to the rest of us. Anyone else? Judy says yes, we do. Judy, just out of curiosity, do you still call them scenarios or do you call them something else? Just let me know. Oh, that's what I suspected. Judy says, no, we call them something else. We call them test cases. Be careful here. Because I already showed you the difference between scenarios and test cases. And I already said, don't write test cases. Now, if you come up with scenarios the way I'm talking about them, but you simply call them test cases, so which means you're just calling them differently, then the question is, do you come up with test cases in the sense that I explained? Do your test cases have input and preconditions and output and post conditions or not? It turns out that really it doesn't matter what you call things. I talked about scenarios and I call them scenarios. If someone says, oh yeah, we come up with those things, but we call them conditions. Or someone says, we come up with those things, but we call them test cases. It's okay. As long as you have another term you use for what I call a test case. And by the way, Judy is the only one who answered. No one else uses scenarios. If there is anything in this webinar I want you to take back to your team, it is the concept of scenarios. I want you to use scenarios, please. I'm going to make this as clear as I can. Do not take requirements and write test cases for those. And Gwen saying we do, but we usually do not document them. Not documenting something to me is equivalent to not doing them. So you need to document your scenario. You have to have a way of saying, for this requirement, here are the scenarios I'm going to test. For this scenario, for this requirement that talks about canceling orders and refunding the money, here are the scenarios. And you list them like that. You say, 1, canceling an order that has been shipped. 2, canceling an order that has not been shipped. 3, canceling an order that has been paid. 4, canceling an order that has not been paid. 5, canceling an order that was shipped outside the country. 6, canceling an order that was paid on a credit card, but the credit card expired. 7, so you got to list all those. If you don't list them, there's no way to test them. It's rhymes, right? If you don't list them, you can't test them. And Chris says we call them functions, and I'm okay with that. So you must have a difference, the distinction between those what I would call lower level functions, because if you're going to say, you know, canceling an order that has been shipped, is that a function? And testing an order that has not been shipped, is it another function? Well, people will normally refer to the whole thing about canceling orders as function. But again, terminology does not matter. All what matters here is to take that requirement and break it down. Remember again what Tammy said earlier about the requirement. She said we need to break it down. Every requirement will need to be broken down. One way to break down requirements is you break them down to scenarios. All right. I'm going to skip the rest of the methodology and get to this practice. Minimize script writing. Again, one more time. Based on my experience, there is nothing worse than having so many scripts, manual or automated, doesn't matter. I've been at a number of organizations that have a nightmare. They have a nightmare maintaining their scripts. And the reason is this. People write a script for every test they want to run. And I'm going to say it as blunt as possible. Do not write a script every time you run a test. If you look at my methodology, you'll find it very simple. You got your test cases here. Don't write test scripts for test cases. You write test scripts for test sets. So what is a test set? Let me go back to the methodology. Okay. A test set here is a group of similar test cases that require the same steps to be executed. Which means I take a bunch of test cases that are similar and I put them into one test set. And then I write one script for that test set. So if I have that requirement about canceling orders, and that requirement happened to have probably easily 50, 60 test cases, I don't have a script for every one of those. Why? Because the steps I need to follow to run a test is the same, regardless of what test I'm running. So I might just put all those 50 test cases into one test set, and I call it the order cancellation test set. And I write one script to be repeated 50 times. Every time I repeat it, it executes one of those test cases. of the test cases that are within the test set. People who do test automation call this data-driven testing. Sometimes they call it table-driven testing. The concept is that we write a script that gets repeated as many times as possible. Every time we repeat it, it executes one set of data, which is a test case. Okay. So when you do that, you certainly are going to have much less scripts. You have less maintenance of the scripts. You have more reusable scripts, meaning that I can go and reuse existing scripts. The only thing I have to change is the test cases. So what I'm talking about here, honestly, is the clear separation between the script, which is the steps we need to execute, from the test cases, which are the data we're going to be using to run the tests. Separate this from this through the test set. If one day your organization decides to move to test automation, then it becomes straightforward. Because you're going to take those manual scripts that you have written and they get translated to automated scripts. All right? Now, continuing our practices, so systematically develop your negative tests. Don't do negative tests as ad hoc. Negative testing is very critical. In fact, if I have to say what could possibly go wrong in a system, it's all about negative testing. Just to let you know that negative testing is so critical, let me ask you a question. If your developers are doing any kind of testing, are they doing positive testing or are they doing negative testing? Anyone here who's willing to say, oh yeah, my developers do a lot of negative testing? No. We, as QA people, do not do a lot of negative testing either. Developers will only do positive testing. If your developers are doing positive testing, and I know, someone can quote me in this and get some developers upset at me, but I don't care. Developers can only do negative testing, positive testing. Developers are not oriented toward doing negative testing. Now, do I always want to generalize? No. Tammy is asking a question, by the way. Actually, she's making comment. Tammy says, I'm trying to train my developers to do negative testing in unit testing as we move to test-driven development. I like that, Tammy. So let me give you a few things that can help you enrich your approach and your strategy to teach your developers. Very quick here, because we have a few minutes. Let's get quick into this here, because I have only 10 minutes left. I think I can cover this in 10 minutes. There are many ways by which we systematically develop our unit tests. One way that's not explained on this slide is this. When you come up with scenarios, and I teach this to people in my classroom, when you come up with scenarios to test, when you take a requirement and break it down into scenarios, I suggest that you split your scenarios to what I call negative scenarios and positive scenarios. Absolutely. That is critical. That's critical. If I come up with 45 scenarios for a given requirement, but I don't know which one of them is negative and which one of them is positive, then I don't know how much negative testing I'm doing. Now, of course, you can ask the question, so what is the negative scenario versus the positive scenario? Well, let me define for you what a negative scenario is, and anything that does not belong to that definition is a positive scenario. All right, here you go. Any scenario you would write that uses invalid data, that's a negative scenario. So if you have a scenario that says canceling an order using an invalid order number. That's an English scenario. Okay? Because you're planning to use some invalid order number. Any scenario, that's the first one, any scenario that it supposes some abnormal or extreme or uncommon condition is a negative scenario. Like what? This is a difficult one. So if you have a scenario that says someone is trying to place an order, but they got disconnected in the middle of the process. Getting disconnected is not a normal condition. It's an abnormal condition. It's an extreme condition. So that scenario is an English scenario. Some person is in the middle of placing an order, and before they click submit, they click the X at the corner of the screen and they close the screen. That's an abnormal behavior. That's it. I mean, should we test that? Of course we should. Someone entered a lot of data and they clicked save for partial things and then close the application. Anything that's abnormal, extreme, and uncommon is a negative scenario. And the last one, because there are three of them, the last one is what I call any shall not do scenarios. Anytime you're trying to force the system to do something that it is not supposed to do. For example, you're trying to cancel an order and refund it, and you do it for a second time. So you go and you take an order that has already been canceled, that has already been refunded, and you say, let me cancel it one more time. Are you supposed to do this? No. But you're trying to, this is shall not do. There's so many shall not do's. The interesting thing is that all these three types of negative scenarios, none of them is normally listed in the requirements, just to let you know. Even if the requirement was written in the most complete fashion, I can tell you no requirement will address those negative scenarios. That's why it becomes very critical for us when we list the scenarios. We say, here are the negative scenarios, here are the positive scenarios. Most likely, all your negative scenarios are not going to be in the requirements. Remember when I told you that you need to know how many of your scenarios are explicitly stated in the requirements? Most of your negative scenarios are not going to be in the requirements. And because of that, you have no way of believing that your developers have tested them. My gosh. Imagine if you list all those negative scenarios and you go back to your developer and say, did you guys test any one of those? No, they did not. And they will try to get away by saying what? They're going to say, oh, we thought you are going to do the negative testing. Most developers will say that. But that's fine, as long as we know what we're responsible for. Okay, so that's actually doing negative testing up front before we even think test cases. Now, once we have test cases, once we have our test cases, what you see in front of you here is the definition of a test case as a baby, right? So now pretend that you took a positive scenario. Now forget about negative scenarios now. We already said we're going to separate positive scenarios from negative scenarios. We're going to use negative scenarios to write test cases. Of course, the test cases you're going to write for negative scenarios are negative test cases. How about positive scenarios? Of course, you're going to use the positive scenarios to write test cases. And the test cases you write from a positive scenario are positive test cases. Good. Now, I'm going to take any one of those positive test cases. Okay? And assuming that that positive test case has a set of inputs, a set of preconditions, and a set of post-conditions, set of outputs. It is positive test case. Now, what am I going to do? There are two things you can do. The first one is to consider every item under the preconditions and develop a different test case. So I got a test case here that says, okay, I'm canceling an order. This is a positive test case. And the preconditions of that test case is that the order has not been canceled before. The order has been paid. The order has not been changed. Well, let's just stop right here. So three of those. Of course, you're going to have about 5, 7, or 8 of those. But let me just do the 3 because I only have 3 minutes. So let's assume that those are 3 preconditions for the positive case. This process is very simple. It says, now go and violate each one of those one at a time. The first precondition says the order exists. Well, guess what? Try to cancel an order that does not exist. That's a negative test. The second one says the order has not been canceled before. Okay, violate it. Try to cancel an order that has already been canceled before. Good. The order has been paid. That's the third one. So okay, try to cancel an order that has not been paid. If you have another precondition that says the order has not been shipped, okay, cancel an order that has been shipped. You see what I'm doing? Very simple. If you did a good job in coming up with the preconditions for your positive test cases, you have a chance to do a better job in coming up with your negative test cases based on those preconditions. Right? Then, based on input, you have the opportunity to do even a better job. You go here and look at the input. Says, okay, what's the input for this test case? It is the order number, for example. I mean, in order to cancel an order, it's the order number. Write test cases using every possible invalid input. So you say, okay, so what is a valid order number? And someone says, an order number is normally a 6-digit number. So okay, let me try 4-digit number. Let me try 7-digit number. Let me try some alphanumeric. Let me try to leave it blank. So exercise every possible invalid value for any input. Between the preconditions and between inputs, I'm going to tell you this. And please trust me on that one. The number of negative test cases will go as high as 10 times the number of positive tests. So now you have to go back and say, how much negative testing are we really doing? And when I ask people this question, I said, how much negative testing are you really doing? And they say, about 20%. I said, you're doing very bad. You're doing very bad. Because the true number of negative test cases is 10 times. 10 times. It's not 20%. It's 10 times. Then you have to live with that. So I hope to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me. Of course, thanks for everyone who joined me. If you have some colleagues in your or associates in your organization who were not able to join us today, let them know that we'll be scheduling this again. All right. Thank you so much for joining me.